The noon sun blazed down on the dusty main street of Redemption Creek, turning the air into a shimmering haze. Wooden signs creaked in the heat, and a slow wind carried swirls of grit between weathered buildings. From the open doors of the saloon, the low murmur of conversation died away as a lone rider came into view. Rhett Colburn, the man half the county called an outlaw and the other half feared to cross, stepped into the street, his boots sinking into the soft dust. But today, he wasn't holding a rifle or wearing the smirk of a man ready for trouble. In his arms lay a boy, pale, limp, and barely breathing, wrapped in a torn blanket. The moment froze. Marshal Elias Trumbull, standing on the boardwalk outside the sheriff's office, narrowed his eyes. Townsfolk peered from porches and windows, their conversations cut short. No one knew why Rhett had come back after nearly 2 years of silence, and no one expected him to return a child. The boy's small head rested against Rhett's chest, his skin almost as white as the sun-bleached road, a thin thread of breath barely moving his lips. Maeve Harkness stepped out from the general store, her hands tightening around her apron. "Lord help us," she whispered under her breath. Across the street, Ephraim Stokes leaned against the saloon's doorway, eyes narrowed, already calculating what this scene might mean. From somewhere far beyond the edge of town came the faint drumming of hooves, a rhythm that didn't belong to friendly riders. The sound rolled closer with each second, building a tension that settled heavy over every heart. Rhett's boots carried him down the center of the street, each step deliberate, as if every ounce of his strength was spent on keeping the boy steady. In his arms, his shirt clung to him with sweat, and dust streaked the side of his face. The whispers around him turned into sharp breaths as more people noticed the distant shapes appearing on the horizon. Riders fanned out, their silhouettes wavering in the heat. Marshal Trumbull stepped off the boardwalk, his hand brushing the butt of his Colt. "What's going on here, Rhett?" he asked, his voice steady but edged with suspicion. Rhett didn't slow. His gaze was fixed ahead, somewhere beyond the marshal, beyond the buildings, beyond whatever this town thought it knew about him. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, but clear enough for everyone to hear. "They didn't come for the cattle," he said, his eyes like steel under the brim of his hat. "They came for me." The morning before the storm rolled into Redemption Creek was slow and bright, the kind of day that made a man believe trouble was still a long way off. Rhett Colburn stood by the corral, mending a section of split-rail fencing. The sun had just begun to climb, casting long shadows across the dry earth. Each strike of his hammer echoed in the stillness, mixing with the distant call of meadowlarks. His shirt sleeves were rolled high, revealing forearms darkened by years of work and wander. To anyone passing by, he looked like nothing more than a ranch hand putting in an honest day's labor, not a man carrying the weight of a reputation that had chased him across 3 territories. From the porch of her boarding house across the street, Maeve Harkness called out to him, holding a steaming mug of coffee. "If you're fixing that fence, you might as well patch the one behind the feed store, too," she teased. Rhett gave her a faint smile and tipped his hat, but his eyes drifted toward the far ridge. Out there, the land rolled into a scrub-choked draw, and beyond that, nothing but miles of bad country. That was where his mind kept wandering lately, not because of the land itself, but because of the whispers that something or someone had been moving through it at night. Later that day, he saddled his bay gelding and rode into town for supplies. The streets were quiet, save for the metallic clang of Ephraim Stokes hammering a horseshoe outside his saloon. Rhett tied his horse near the general store, noting the new bullet holes in the side of the building, fresh enough to glint silver in the sun. Inside, Clara Voss was restocking flour sacks, her hands moving fast but her eyes sharp. She glanced up at Rhett, then leaned closer over the counter. "You hear about the riders up near Blackwater Creek?" she asked, voice low. He shook his head, and she added, "They weren't passing through. They were looking for someone." Rhett loaded his saddlebags with coffee beans, ammunition, and jerky, but Clara's words stayed with him. As he stepped back outside, he noticed a boy standing across the street, half hidden behind the post office. The kid's clothes were ragged, his face smudged with dust, and he was clutching something tight in his hands. When their eyes met, the boy turned and slipped into the alley. Rhett followed, but by the time he reached the corner, the alley was empty, save for a crumpled scrap of paper lying in the dirt. He picked it up, smoothing it between his fingers. The note was scrawled in a rough hand. "If you see him, keep him safe. They'll be here by sundown." Rhett's jaw tightened. The paper smelled faintly of smoke, and the edges were still warm, as if it had been written in a hurry. He folded it and slipped it into his pocket, a faint unease settling in his gut by the time Rhett rolled back toward his small cabin on the outskirts of town. The sun was dipping lower, painting the land in shades of gold and red. The breeze had changed, cooler now, carrying the scent of rain and something else beneath it, something metallic. He glanced back at the ridge, the same ridge he'd been watching all morning. For the first time in years, Rhett couldn't shake the feeling that the trouble he'd spent half his life outrunning was already riding hard in his direction by dawn. Rhett Colburn was already awake, sitting at the small table in his cabin with the scrap of paper laid out before him. The words were simple, but they carried a weight he couldn't shake. Keep him safe. There was no name, no signature, but the urgency was unmistakable. He poured himself a cup of coffee, watching the steam curl upward, and tried to convince himself. It wasn't his problem. He'd walked away from other people's troubles before. It was safer that way for everyone. But something about the boy's eyes from yesterday kept gnawing at him, like a thorn he couldn't pull free. The knock came just after sunrise, sharp, hurried, and out of place in the stillness of the morning. Rhett opened the door to find Maeve Harkness standing there, her hands gripping the shoulders of the same boy he'd seen by the post office. The child's hair was damp from dew, his cheeks flushed from running. "Found him sleeping in the livery stable," Maeve said, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting someone to follow. "He says he's looking for you." Rhett looked from her to the boy, who clutched a small leather satchel to his chest. Inside, the boy, Toby Fenwick, he said his name was, barely touched the plate of eggs Maeve set in front of him. Between mouthfuls, he explained in halting words that men had been following him for 2 days, ever since his uncle had sent him away with something important. He didn't say what was in the satchel, and Rhett didn't press, though his curiosity burned. Maeve sat in silence, her eyes moving between them. Finally, she stood. "If half of what he says is true, you can't just turn him out," she said quietly. By mid-morning, word had spread. Marshal Elias Trumbull rode up to Rhett's cabin, dust on his boots and suspicion in his eyes. "I heard you've got company," he said flatly. "If this kid is mixed up in something, it's best you hand him over now. I can keep him safe in town." Rhett studied the marshal's face. Trumbull wasn't a cruel man, but lawmen in these parts answered to more than justice. Sometimes they answered to whoever had the most pull. And Rhett had a strong hunch that whoever was after Toby had plenty of it. Rhett walked to the window, watching a pair of riders moving slowly along the far ridge. His mind churned. Walking away meant going back to quiet days and solitary nights, but it also meant knowing he'd left a kid to fend for himself against men who wouldn't stop. Staying meant painting a target on his own back, maybe dragging Maeve into it too. When he turned back to face them, the decision was already made. "He stays here," Rhett said, his voice steady. "And if they come looking, they'll have to get through me first." By late afternoon, the heat had settled heavy over Redemption Creek, pressing down like a weight. Rhett Colburn stood on the porch of his cabin, arms crossed, scanning the horizon. The two riders he'd seen earlier on the ridge had vanished, but he knew they hadn't gone far. Men like that didn't just pass through. They circled, they waited, and they watched. Inside, Toby Fenwick sat cross-legged on the floor, turning the small leather satchel over in his hands like it was the only thing keeping him anchored. Maeve Harkness busied herself at the stove. Though Rhett noticed she kept glancing toward the windows, the first real sign came in the form of smoke. Thin, black tendrils curled upward from beyond the ridge to the south. Too dark for a campfire. Too steady to be accidental. Rhett's jaw tightened. He'd seen it before. A signal. They're talking to someone, he muttered. Maeve followed his gaze, her lips pressing into a thin line. Then they're not alone, she said. The air seemed to grow hotter, thicker, as if the land itself knew something was coming. Later, Rhett saddled his gelding and rode into town under the pretense of buying nails from the general store, but the streets felt wrong. Conversation stopped. When he passed, men leaned against doorways, watching with flat eyes. Even the saloon was quieter than usual, the piano silent, the smell of whiskey mixing with the faint scent of gun oil. Ephraim Stokes leaned on the bar, giving Rhett a nod. That felt more like a warning than a greeting. "There's strangers poking around the outskirts," he said casually. "A skin about a man fits your description." When Rhett returned home, the shadows were long, and the air carried the scent of rain, sharp, metallic, and restless. Toby was still inside, but Maeve met Rhett at the door, her face pale. "Someone came by while you were gone," she said. Didn't say much, just left this. She handed him a folded slip of paper. The message was short. "The boy isn't yours to keep." No signature, but the handwriting was the same jagged scrawl as the note from the day before. That night, Rhett kept the lamps low and the windows open, listening. Somewhere in the distance, the faint echo of hoofbeats carried through the dark, too slow and deliberate to be random travel. Every creak of the cabin's old boards felt louder. Toby finally drifted to sleep in the chair, the satchel clutched against his chest, but Rhett stayed awake, his hand never far from the Colt on the table. When the first shadow passed across the window, Rhett didn't move. He just stared into the night, knowing the time for hiding was ending, and the trouble was closer than anyone in Redemption. Creek wanted to believe Dot morning broke with a sky the color of tarnished silver, clouds hanging low over the valley. Rhett Colburn stepped out onto the porch, his gaze sweeping the tree line. The air was still, but it carried a sense of expectation, like the world was holding its breath. Inside, Toby Fenwick was eating slowly, eyes darting to the windows every few bites. Maeve Harkness poured coffee, but didn't speak, her movements quiet and deliberate. Then came the sound, the steady, synchronized rhythm of hooves approaching. Not the scattered gallop of travelers. This was formation riding, the kind men used when they wanted to make an impression. 3 riders emerged from the south trail, their silhouettes sharp against the pale sky. The man in front, broad-shouldered and wearing a long oilskin coat, reined in just short of the porch. "Morning, Colburn," he said, his voice carrying the calm menace of someone who never had to raise it. "Name's Harlan Duval. We've been looking for the boy." His tone made it sound less like a request and more like a certainty. Rhett didn't move from the top step. "Not my habit to hand over children to strangers," he said evenly. Duval's eyes flickered, a faint smile tugging at one corner of his mouth. Behind him, the other 2 riders shifted in their saddles, their hands resting casually near their sidearms. "He's not yours to keep," Duval said. "Best thing for everyone is you step aside. The folks I work for, they don't like to be kept waiting." Maeve appeared in the doorway, a rifle cradled in her arms, though she didn't raise it. "If you want the boy," she said, "you'll have to explain why." Duval's gaze slid past Rhett to her, the smile gone now. "You wouldn't believe." "Me," he said. and it wouldn't matter if you did. His horse shifted impatiently, hooves scuffing the dirt. The tension hung so thick it seemed the very air might snap. Rhett stepped forward, closing the distance to the edge of the porch. "You can tell your employers," he said, his voice low and deliberate, "that if they want the boy, they'll have to come themselves. And when they do, they better bring more than 3 men." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Duval gave a single nod, as if confirming something only he understood. Without another word, he turned his horse and rode back the way he came, his men following close. When the dust from their departure finally settled, Rhett let out a slow breath. He knew this was no victory, only a delay. Somewhere out there, more riders would be coming, and next time, they wouldn't bother with polite conversation. The rain finally came that night, slanting in from the west and drumming against the cabin roof. Rhett Colburn sat at the table, watching the flames in the small stove twist and flicker. Toby Fenwick was curled up in a blanket nearby, the leather satchel still clutched to his chest even in sleep. Maeve Harkness sat across from Rhett, her eyes on him. "You know they'll be back," she said softly. "And next time, they won't be asking." Rhett didn't answer right away. His mind was on Duval's words and the unsettling calm behind them. When the knock came, it was so light it almost blended with the rain. Rhett opened the door to find Marshal Elias Trumbull standing there, water dripping from his hat. "We need to talk," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Trumbull's expression was harder than usual, and his gaze went straight to the satchel. "You know what's in there?" he asked. Rhett shook his head. Trumbull exhaled slowly. "Inside that bag is a ledger. Names, dates, payments, proof that Gideon Rourke has been paying lawmen and politicians to look the other way for years, and one of those names is mine." Maeve's eyes widened. "You're admitting this to us?" she asked. Trumbull's jaw tightened. "Because it doesn't matter anymore. Once Rourke knows the boy's with you, every man on his payroll will come riding." He glanced at Toby, still asleep. The kid's uncle worked for Rourke, kept the books. When he found out what was really going on, he ran. Didn't make it far. Got the boy out, though, and the ledger with him. The room felt smaller now, the air heavier. Rhett leaned back in his chair, piecing it together. "So it's not just the boy they want. It's what he's carrying." Trumbull nodded grimly. "That ledger could ruin Rourke and half the territory's so-called respectable men. You think they'll let that happen?" His voice dropped lower. "They'll burn this whole town. To the ground first." Maeve stood and moved to the window, looking out at the darkness beyond. "If that's true, we can't keep hiding," she said. "They'll corner us here." Rhett's eyes followed the rain running down the glass. "No," he said slowly. "We don't hide. We make the first move." Trumbull looked at him sharply. "You're talking about going to Rourke?" Rhett's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "I'm talking about ending this before the whole valley gets swallowed up in blood." The decision was set, but the cost would be steep, and there would be no turning back. The rain had stopped by morning, leaving the ground slick and the air heavy with the scent of wet earth. Rhett Colburn tightened the cinch on his gelding, the leather creaking in the quiet. Toby Fenwick stood nearby, his small hands clutching the satchel like a lifeline. Maeve Harkness hovered on the porch, worry etched deep into her face. "You don't have to do this alone," she said. Rhett shook his head. "If I take you or the boy into that meeting, it's over before it starts." His voice was steady, but his mind was a storm. The plan was reckless, maybe even suicidal. Ride into the abandoned stockyard outside town, where Gideon Rourke's men were known to gather, and offer himself as the bargaining chip. If he could get close enough to Rourke, maybe he could end this without a bullet being fired, or at least buy enough time for Maeve and Trumbull to get Toby out of the territory. But riding straight into the viper's nest meant one wrong move could get him killed before he said a word. The stockyard was a skeleton of splintered fences and rotting beams, the wind whistling through gaps in the old planks. As Rhett approached, he saw them, half a dozen riders fanning out, rifles resting casually in their hands. In the center stood Harlan Duvall, that same calm menace in his eyes. "You came," Duvall said, almost amused. Rhett dismounted slowly, his hands visible. "I'm here for Rourke," he said. "Tell him I want to talk." Duvall's smirk deepened. "Talk? That's a luxury you don't have. You've been sheltering something that doesn't belong to you." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You think you can walk into the lion's den and walk out again?" Rhett didn't flinch. "Depends on whether your boss wants this to end in smoke or in blood." The riders around them shifted, the tension snapping tight. A shout from the far side of the yard broke the moment. Another rider galloping in, breathless. He leaned down to whisper something to Duvall, whose expression darkened. Whatever news he'd heard, it rattled him enough to make him glance toward the road leading back to Redemption Creek. Rhett seized the moment, stepping closer until their boots nearly touched. "Seems like you've got more than one fire to put out," he said. "Let me see Rourke. Now." Duvall hesitated, then motioned sharply to his men. Two of them flanked Rhett, rifles still ready, and began leading him toward the far gate. The gamble had worked, for now. But with each step deeper into Rourke's territory, Rhett felt the ground beneath him turn to ice. One slip, one wrong. Word, and this would end with his body face down in the mud dot. The gate of the stockyard creaked open, revealing a shadowed interior lit by a few weak lanterns. Rhett Colburn was led inside, flanked by two of Gideon Rourke's armed men. The smell of damp hay and old blood clung to the air. At the far end, seated in a weathered chair like it was a throne, was Rourke himself, a tall, broad man with eyes as cold as the iron rails around them. "Colburn," Rourke said, his voice deep and deliberate, "you've been making my week very complicated." Rhett stopped a few paces away, hands still visible at his sides. "You've got a problem you can't shoot your way out of," he said evenly, "and I've got something you want." Rourke leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "The boy?" he said simply. "Give him to me, and maybe you walk out of here." Rhett shook his head. "It's not the boy you care about, it's what he's carrying." That earned a faint smile from Rourke, but it didn't reach his eyes. Before Rourke could reply, the side door banged open. Marshal Elias Trumbull stepped inside, rainwater dripping from his coat, a pistol leveled at Rourke's men. "It's over," Trumbull said. "That ledger's already been copied. If anything happens to the boy, the whole territory sees it by morning." The room froze. Rhett's eyes flicked to the marshal. He hadn't expected him to come, much less with such a bold move. Rourke stood slowly, towering over the space between them. "You think I care about exposure?" he asked. "Half the men in this room are in that ledger. The other half would kill to make sure it disappears." He stepped closer to Rhett. "What I want to know is why you're willing to die for someone else's fight." Rhett's jaw tightened. "Because someone has to." The tension broke not with a gunshot, but with a voice from the shadows. "Because it's his fight, too." Everyone turned to see Maeve Harkness step into the lantern light, the ledger in her hands. "Toby's father wasn't just some bookkeeper," she said, her eyes locked on Rourke. "He was Rhett's brother." Gasps rippled through the room. Rhett didn't deny it. The truth shifted the air like a sudden wind. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was blood. For a moment, no one moved. Then Rourke's expression changed, calculation overtaking fury. "Maybe we can talk," he said slowly. The guns lowered slightly, but the danger hadn't passed. The next word spoken would decide whether Redemption Creek saw dawn in peace, or under the smoke of burning rooftops the room felt like a tinderbox, ready to catch fire. Rhett Colburn stood between Gideon Rourke and the others, the truth of his connection to Toby hanging heavy in the air. For the first time, Rourke seemed to hesitate. His eyes flicked from Rhett to Maeve Harkness, then to Marshal Elias Trumbull. "If that ledger sees daylight," Rourke said, his voice low and measured, "every man I've built alliances with will turn on me." Rhett didn't blink. "Then maybe it's time you stop building on Rod." One of Rourke's men shifted uneasily, lowering his rifle an inch. Others followed, sensing the shift in balance. Trumbull kept his gun steady, his voice carrying in the tense silence. "You can walk away from this, Rourke. Give us your word you'll leave the boy and this town alone, and maybe we forget the rest." Rourke's jaw worked, his pride warring with the cold logic of survival. Maeve stepped forward, holding the ledger up where the lantern light caught it. "This doesn't have to end in blood," she said. "But if you force our hand, it will." For a long moment, the only sound was the rain tapping against the tin roof. Then Rourke exhaled, slow and deliberate, and raised his hand slightly, not in surrender, but in acknowledgement. "You've got backbone, Colburn," he said. "I'll give you that. Keep the boy. But remember, you've made enemies. That don't forgive." He turned to Duval. "Call the men off." The order hung in the air like a verdict. Duval's eyes narrowed, but he obeyed, motioning for the riders outside to disperse. The sound of hooves fading into the distance was like pressure easing off a wound, though no one dared relax just yet. Rhett lowered his stance but kept his eyes locked on Rourke, knowing the man's word was only as good as the ground it stood on. Trumbull holstered his gun and stepped closer to Rhett. "You bought time," he said quietly, "but that ledger's still a target. Keep it safe." Maeve slipped it back into her satchel, her fingers tight around the strap. Toby, who had been hidden behind a stack of crates, stepped out and looked up at Rhett. There was a flicker of relief in the boy's eyes, but also something harder. The kind of knowledge no child should have to carry. As Rourke's men cleared out and the last lanterns flickered low, Rhett realized the fight wasn't truly over. But for tonight, Redemption Creek would sleep under a sky unlit by flames. And that, for now, was enough. 3 years later, the wind still carried the scent of sage and dust across Redemption Creek, but the town had changed. The old stockyard, where Gideon Rourke once held court, was gone, replaced by a modest open square where cattlemen traded and children played. Rhett Colburn stood near the hitching post outside Maeve Harkness's boarding house, his hat pulled low to shade his eyes. He looked older, the lines around his face deeper, but there was a steadiness in his posture that hadn't been there before. From the doorway, Maeve stepped out with a tray of fresh coffee, setting it on the small table by the porch. "You waiting for someone?" she asked. Rhett gave her a faint smile. "Toby's due back today." Her face softened. The boy? No. The young man now had been away in Abilene, learning to read and write with a level of skill few in these parts possessed. The ledger, long since copied and hidden in safe hands, had been the key to dismantling Rourke's grip on the territory. A sound of hoofbeats broke the quiet. Down the street rode Toby Fenwick, taller now, his back straight in the saddle. When he saw Rhett, he swung down and crossed the distance with a grin. "You kept the place standing," Toby said. "Figured you'd have rebuilt it twice by now." Rhett chuckled, clapping him on the shoulder. "Didn't see the need. Some things are worth leaving as they are, scars and all." The townsfolk gathered slowly, offering greetings and pats on the back. Marshal Elias Trumbull was among them, his badge still shining, but his hair more gray than black. He shook Toby's hand firmly. "Good to see you back," he said. "Place hasn't been The same without you. Toby glanced at Rhett, and there was an unspoken understanding between them. The kind built through danger survived together. As the sun dipped low, the group settled in the square, sharing stories and coffee. Maeve handed Rhett a cup, her eyes meeting his. Funny thing, she said quietly. For all the gunfights and threats, it wasn't the fastest draw that saved this town. Rhett looked out at Toby, laughing with the children by the fountain. No, he said, his voice low and certain. It was the hand that reached out first. The last light of day painted the town in gold as Rhett tipped his hat against the setting sun. The fight for Redemption Creek was over, but its memory lived on, not in the wounds, but in the bonds that refused to break. And for Rhett Colburn, that was worth more than any victory.